Hi, you're listening to At Home with AI, relatable AI for regular people. I'm Stephanie, and today I have a question for you. Are you ready to do shots with AI? Okay, I'm sorry, that was a really bad joke, but what we're going to be talking about today is whether you should give examples with your prompt and how many should you give. And it happens that is referred to as shot prompting. Like zero shot prompting is when you give zero examples. One shot prompting is, you guessed it, when you give one example. And few shot prompting is when you include several examples with your prompt. So sorry for the bad joke. But, just like people learn by example, AI tools do too. But you want to be careful because there's some cases in which you don't want to give examples. So let's talk about it. First of all, when do you include one example, also known as one-shot prompting? So I include one example with my prompt when I want a specific output format. And sometimes it's just easier to show an example rather than trying to explain in words what you mean. So for example, let's say I want dates in a certain format. So in my example, my prompt was, I'm going to provide a list of baby milestones and how old my baby was. She was born on February 2nd, 2020. This is made up. I don't have a baby born that day, but return the list with formatted dates. So for example, first steps at 11 months, you would want first steps and then in parentheses, January 2, 2021. So if I didn't have that example in there, I would have to try to explain, write the month out in full and put the date and a comma. It's a little bit more complicated than just writing the date the way you want it. And that doesn't just apply to numbers, any kind of thing. Another example is maybe you want emoji faces to represent the emotion behind a sentence. So when do you include several examples, also known as few shot prompting? Some of the reasons I might find myself doing that. One reason is when I want to explain a complex idea and it's just hard to put into words. So for example, I might say, describe these dates relative to June 1st, 2026. Examples. Input is 6/2/26, output is tomorrow. Or input is 5/28/26, output is last Thursday. I'm sure there's some way to explain it, but giving those examples will help it make more sense for the AI tool without you having to rack your brain about how to explain that. Many examples are also good if you want to account for edge cases. So here, another one with baby ages. Let's say, how when babies are really young, you describe their age in days, and then you describe their age in weeks, and then in months, and then in years, right? So if you have a certain way you want those dates to be formatted, you might similarly, let's say my imaginary baby who was born on February 2nd, if you're talking about February 23rd, the output might be 3 weeks. But if you're talking about February 22nd, 2 years later, the output might be 2 years. So by giving a whole number of examples showing the way you want those dates to be formatted, again, it's easier than trying to write out a rule with, use weeks until you reach this age. It's just maybe easier to do it that way. So anytime you have a more complicated situation that's difficult to understand in words, examples can be handy. Finally, I want to talk about when not to include examples. You might be thinking, why wouldn't I include examples? It seems like that's always the answer. But there's a couple of cases you don't want to include examples. One of them, it might be to save tokens, right? It might be to save money. And on a small scale, putting some extra text in your prompt doesn't matter. And this, usually my podcast here applies to personal uses of AI. And this probably won't apply to you if you're just chatting with an AI tool. But if you are running a prompt on, let's say, thousands of rows of data, you want that prompt to be as lightweight as possible. So, it will cost you money, it might cost you time, and if you include a lot of examples. Another reason not to include examples is simply if you want to save time and brain power, or maybe it's just easier to ask your question and see if it works before you go and come up with examples. So in those date examples, you might say, how old was my baby at all these times? And if it gives you the wrong format back, you might say, oh, when they're young, I want it in weeks, right? And the AI tool will probably just be able to figure it out. The most important one, though, is you want to avoid using examples when you're brainstorming, and you want to avoid constraints, because AI will sometimes take your examples quite literally. And if you're trying to brainstorm and you want a variety of answers, giving examples might cause it to respond in a sort of constrained or predictive way. I saw an example of this and I'm racking my brain trying to find it again. I think it was from Ethan Mollick. I thought it was in his book, Co-Intelligence. I've looked through the book again. I can't find it. So if you're brainstorming something, in this example, the author was brainstorming product names, I think. And if you give a few examples of product names that have something in common, let's say, I think in this example, they were either animal names or maybe they're a fruit, the results you get might also follow that theme, and maybe that's not what you intend. Large language models will recognize those kind of patterns, and this will kind of prime them to give results that aren't as creative. Another example, if let's say you're doing some sort of customer service examples, and let's say all of your examples have negative responses, let's say you never give anyone a refund, the tool might intuit that it should also act that way. So if you want to avoid those kind of constraints, especially when you're brainstorming, especially when you're trying to get those wild, creative seeming answers, it can be better to leave out those examples and, even to specify, I want a really diverse set of results. Think of things that have nothing in common, right? Because that will get you more, quote, creativity. All right, that's it for today. I hope that's helpful. Don't do too many shots with AI. Sometimes do no shots. And until next time, you can find the post version of this podcast on my Substack. That's athomewithai.substack.com. Again, that's athomewithai.substack.com.